Hello, hello, and welcome to Inner Work for Greater Good. My name is Emily Eldridge. I am coming at you today with wet hair. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've actually done previous episodes with my hair like pulled back in a bun, like this, like pulled really, tightly back. And that's usually because my hair is wet. So I know, sorry, sometimes I take a shower right before the show. So this time I decided, you know what, I'm not going to hide it. I got wet hair. Hey, y'all. So anyway, welcome to my show where we talk about inner work that accelerates your power to make a difference, whether you got clean hair or not, which I frequently don't because I work from home, so I can be schleppy a lot of the times. Today's topic is actually a refrain that I had a lot, I would say last year, about a year ago today. And that was with a certain person in my life. And that was, why don't you just ask? Why don't you just ask? Well, why don't you just ask? Why don't you just ask them? Just ask them. I'm laughing now. Thank God this person's in a different place now. Things have changed quite a bit. But the point is that I was saying this to someone who I'm close to in my life, who was in a new situation. And there were a lot of questions that weren't answered in that situation. He wanted answers. He needed things. He needed resources, etc. And, from his superiors, from his bosses, whatever, from the people around him. And I said, well, why don't you just ask them? Well, just ask that question. You need that information, just ask for it. And he'd be like, no. And he got progressively more and more miserable in this situation. And I'd be like, just ask them. They might be able to give you what you need. But instead he would moan about the fact that he would have to ask, or he'd moan about the fact that they didn't just give it to him, or they didn't answer that question without prompting, or provide him with what he needed. And so it was just, I'm laughing now, but it was actually really frustrating at the time because I was like, just ask, it's not a big deal. But of course, like with everything, especially when we're thinking about people in our lives, or I'm sure people can see us sometimes like this too, it looks like such a simple situation. Well, why don't you just, you might even, it's like fill in the blank. Well, why don't you just do X, Y, or Z? And then the person doesn't do it, or we don't do it. And it's like, well, why not? If it's so simple and so easy, why don't we just do it? And there can be many reasons for that. As always, we're talking about inner work. We're talking about inner stuff that causes us to do or not do things, or to do them a certain way or not a certain way. And so the point is, this is a situation where, I was like, come on, why don't you just ask? And in his case, I think that he was just stuck in, well, I'm not going to get into that. I'll tell you what happened later. But let's get into why don't you just ask? And as I'm sharing these thoughts, I want you to consider your own life in which you might be in certain situations where, it could be something really simple, a question answered, or maybe you want to make a request of someone for something, or maybe, you want a discount, or maybe it's something bigger, like, asking if you want someone to marry you, or, or even, wanting a new place to live. I mean, there's so many questions in our lives, right? And there are so many needs and requests that we have and desires that we have. And so as you're, hearing this, just think about situations where you might be, I'm changing this color here. Think of situations where you might not be asking for whatever it is you need, and consider some of the underlying reasons why. Let's just say, it comes down to one word, usually fear. Okay, so why don't you just ask, what are you afraid of? Now, some people would say, well, the worst they can say is no, right? You've heard this before. Well, no can be a really big word. No it's just 2 letters, and it can be a very, very big word, because with the word no often implies disappointment. It often implies an emotional outcome or charge or results from hearing that word no. And so a lot of times people don't ask, and we don't ask because we're afraid we're going to be told no. And while it may seem simple to go, well, what's the worst they can say? What's the worst they can do? Is they just say no? It's like, yeah, but that no can be really painful or hurtful or disappointing. You could really have a lot hinged on that question. And if someone says no, that can be huge. This is more than just is it okay if I borrow your parking spot in the city for a while? I mean, whatever, but no is a big one. And no brings with it all kinds of emotional baggage, oftentimes. And so that no that we hear from other people, or that we're afraid of hearing if we ask for what we need or we ask for something, can be one of the big reasons why we don't ask in the first place, because we don't want to be heard no, because we don't want to be denied, because we don't, even if the person says it kindly, there's still that implicit, like, that letdown, that sadness. And so there's the fear of disappointment. Fear of disappointment is one of the biggest fears I think that any of us has. And one of the biggest fears sort of in the world, believe it or not, even though you think like fear of death, well, yeah, okay. But fear of disappointment is a really, really big one that underlies a lot of why people don't ask for what they need or do what they feel called to do or what they want to do. So the fear of disappointment and being told no, or getting the answer that you really don't want, whether it's no or something that's the equivalent. Fear of, second one would be, these are probably the two biggest ones. There are many other reasons why we'd be afraid of asking, but fear of anger, shame, judgment. So fear of the other person's emotional reaction to us in response to our asking for something or saying we need something. We're afraid of them judging us. We're afraid of them getting angry at us for even asking. We're afraid of being shamed for wanting that thing. So, or it could be any, what are some other emotions? I don't know, that people can have in reaction to us asking for something or asking for what we need or even wanting that thing. So a lot of times what we're trying to do when we don't ask, when we're afraid of asking, why don't you just ask for it? Why don't you just ask? Why don't you just ask for, just talk to that person? Well, maybe we're afraid of their reaction to us. We're afraid of their emotional response to whatever it is that, our question results in. And so that can be it. We're afraid of their emotions, which also means that we're afraid of our own emotions. When we're afraid of someone else's emotional reaction to us, we're also afraid of how that will make us feel. Because someone could just as easily say, well, what's the worst that can happen? They get mad at you. Okay, yeah, they might get mad at you, but that can trigger all kinds of awful things. There are reasons why we might be scared of someone being mad at us because of all kinds of things that triggers. And that gets into, where did these fears come from? Now, those were just two fears, but I think those are the biggest ones: fear of disappointment, fear of anger, shaming, judgment, whatever that might come at us, or other people thinking negatively towards us. So where did these fears come from? I would say mostly childhood. In childhood, it's just the nature of childhood. We are reliant on other people for our needs to be met. We're reliant on adults or parents to feed us. We're reliant on, teachers to teach us. We're reliant on other people to transport us places. Childhood is a lot about having to trust the people around you. And even when you don't trust them, and even when you don't feel safe with them, you still have to somehow adapt. Because as a 5-year-old, you might be in an abusive situation, but what are you going to do? Live on the street? And of course, yeah, some 5-year-olds have ended up living on the street. But, child makes that unconscious calculation that it's like, well, what do I need to do to survive? And so as children, we are hyper reliant on other people. Now, sometimes we can grow up in environments where our needs were met and when our requests were responded to politely, or where we asked for something and it was given to us, or, it was explained why that wasn't appropriate for us to have it. And maybe we didn't like that, but we weren't shamed or raged at or hit or anything in response to our needing something or wanting something or asking for something. But then at the other extreme, we can also grow up in environments where our needs and our wants and our asks, our requests are met with attack, shaming, rage, judgment, physical assault, ignoring. So they can also be met with neglect and not having our needs met. And sometimes this can happen explicitly, where it's like you asked for something as a child and you were told straight up, no, or like, no, what's wrong with you for thinking that or even wanting that? No, that's stupid or whatever. And so we can learn that, oh no, my needing something or asking for something is going to get a bad reaction. So you know what? I'm just going to protect myself by not asking. And what happens though, is we end up with these triggers and these wounds inside of us and these protective mechanisms that I'm always talking about, those X powers, as I call them, that form to protect us from getting hurt like that again. So sometimes we can grow up in environments where that's the reaction, and it's an explicit reaction to our asking for something. Another thing, though, can be more implicit or more sort of subconscious that we take on, and that is there's no point in asking anyone for what I need because I'm not going to get it. Maybe because we saw that the people around us were so preoccupied by their own dramas or their own issues or their own needs or their own fears or their own whatever addictions, that we just learned, you know what, this person, whether it's a parent, but some kind of adult that was in a position to give us what we needed and take care of us, we might have taken on an unconscious belief that said, nope, it doesn't matter. There's no point in my asking. It's not going to work. They can't give that to me. They're not capable in this moment of doing it, or they're not interested, or they're just going to ignore me, or what have you. And so the point is that as children, in that time of our lives, when we are most dependent on others, and we have needs and we have desires and we have requests and we're reliant on other people for those to be met, that's when those messages, those very deep-seated messages form about whether or not we're going to get what we need when we ask for it, or get what we want when we ask for it. And also those deep-seated beliefs of how are people going to react to us? And do I even deserve? Am I even worthy of this thing that I'm wanting? Or am I stuck with the way things are and there's just no point in even trying and even asking? It's just like the question doesn't even happen because it's like, whatever, this is just the way it is. And it almost doesn't even occur to you, well, wait a minute, I could actually ask for something. I could actually get different results. There might be actually somebody who could help me with this, right? Sometimes it doesn't even occur to us, especially if we've grown up in environments of neglect or abandonment, where basically we were just, our own needs were dismissed or ignored. And so the messages that we received consciously and unconsciously, or the beliefs that we formed in response to our environment as children, that is a big part, that is a huge thing that determines whether we ask for things, how we ask for things. That's a good point too, actually, how we ask for things. There's some people who learned that, well, the only way I'm going to get what I want is if I throw a temper tantrum. And so that may be what you end up doing, is you realize you start to have this temper tantrum reaction inside of you. Well, maybe because that's how you got responses from the adults around you. Maybe that was one of your coping mechanisms for getting your needs met. Whereas others, maybe they go into a like, oh, poor me. And then somebody else goes, oh, honey, oh, what do you need? Whoa. And then they get their needs met. So we also have the how. How did we go about getting our needs met? If we found ways of doing that. Again, as children, we're brilliant at this. We're really, really brilliant at learning tactics for trying to get our needs met. So those are some of the things that determine, whether, your sort of response to well, why don't you just ask? Well, why don't you just ask for it? And the emotional reactions that you might have to that, or even to the thought of asking for something. Let me just make another big point. Asking for something or having needs, asking for something and wanting and needing to rely on someone else for information or whatever it is. That's a very vulnerable position that can often trigger these feelings of vulnerability, because it means that you're not just an island unto yourself, completely self-reliant. Now, I know that also self-reliance is something that we can end up forming in childhood, but it can be like a hyper-independence. And that hyper-independence, while it's like, well, I can rely on myself and I'm strong and I meet my own needs, but that can also come out of trauma too, of not having your needs met and realizing no one was there for you. So when you're in a position then, especially if you're someone who's hyper-independent or hyper-self-reliant, notice how you react and how you feel when you need something from someone else, or when you feel like you need to ask for something and you're not getting your needs met, and that fear comes up and those triggers come up, those defenses or those walls, or there's just those emotional reactions, those parts come up. Notice what comes up, how you may have reactions to that, to even asking for something, because it is a very vulnerable thing. It means basically saying, I need something from you, and I cannot control whether or not you give it to me. I cannot, it's meaning that somebody else, has some, could have some impact on you. And so that can be a very vulnerable position to be in. So that's something else that's implicit in asking for something, or especially asking other people for what we need. So those are some considerations. Now I want to go back to the man I was talking about in the beginning. Remember, he's the one who I even came up with, well, why don't you just ask? Why don't you just ask? And I kept saying to him, why don't you just ask? Why don't you? And he would just get, no, no, no. I'm like, sweetheart, just, why don't you just ask, you know? And finally, and I don't even know what it was that prompted this, but finally he started asking. He actually started asking his bosses. He started asking his coworkers. He started asking for what he needed and asking questions and trying to get answers. And I don't remember like what changed it. Maybe, you know, we've done some emotional work together, or, you know, I don't even remember what it was. But the point is, I'll never forget, he came home one day and he said, wow, I asked my supervisor a question and he answered, and it was great. And then another time he was like, I asked for this thing that in my old office we never would have gotten, but I asked in this office, and guess what? He immediately responded to me and said, oh, well, we're doing this and we're doing that, and yeah, this is coming down the pike or whatever. And he was just like, oh, it was like a revelation. It was like a revelation to him that asking for something could actually get his needs met, that he could actually get a positive response and a supportive response and a response at all to him asking for something that he needed. And it was like everything just opened up. Everything just opened up, and all of a sudden he was happy. And I think it's because in his case, in his childhood, he grew up in situations where he was stuck. There was no point in making any requests for anything because the adults around him were too self-absorbed in their own dramas and their own issues, plus they were abusive to him. And also he was stuck in situations that he couldn't control. I mean, just the reality of where he was living and who he was living with. He was a kid, he couldn't do anything about that. And the adults in his life were the ones who controlled that. And so I think what this did was, when suddenly he's in this new situation and he was having to ask for things or wanted things to be better, it kind of flipped him back into that childhood place of like just being miserable and not realizing he had any kind of agency or power to change it. See, that was the difference, is that he realized something, that he actually had the power to change it. Now on the outside, I'm looking at him going, well, you have the power to change this. Like, this is not a big deal. To me, it's not a big deal, but to him, it was huge, 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 because that was the nature of his childhood, is couldn't change it. And there was no point in asking for what he needed, because people were not going to respond to it, or they were going to respond negatively and tell him that he was being a spoiled brat, or that he was wanting too much, or whatever the response might have been, you see? But when he realized, and I think he did some emotional work on himself, actually, I don't remember what happened. But the point is, when he realized, like, wait a minute, I actually have some agency here. Wait a minute, I could just ask. I mean, they could say no, but you know what? All right. And then when he actually started asking, then things started to change. So I just thought you'd have a fun, sort of fun way to wrap up this episode and let you know about the power of asking. And but in order to get to that point, you got to first ask yourself, well, why don't you just ask, right? Why don't you just ask? And if you notice some stuff pop up, dig into those, do the drawing out process like I share with you in my community, changelight.world, free community, free intro course, and draw those parts out that might be getting in the way of you getting what you need, because you're not going to get it unless you ask for it. We don't get things unless we ask for them, whether it's explicitly or to the universe or otherwise. All right, I hope this has been helpful. As always, I'm Emily with changelight.world, and I really hope you'll join our free community and take the free course. It's all really, really great. And I've got some fun stuff coming up that I'll be launching very, very soon in the next couple of weeks. Very exciting. Podcast. All right, I'll see you later.